Time had done what no one in the court had ever truly wanted it to do. It had made the crown prince into a man, not a polished boy in silk, not a carefully instructed heir arranged at proper distances from his own heart, not the kind of prince old ministers liked best, handsome enough to display, obedient enough to steer, and emotionally distant enough to survive being used without ever learning to call it by its proper name. No, time had done something far more dangerous. It had made Jin into the kind of man the court had spent 26 years secretly hoping he would not become. By the time he rode back into Hanseong, he no longer carried the soft, unfinished promise of future kingship. He carried something heavier than promise. Presence. It was in the way he sat a horse, not vainly, not theatrically, but with the easy certainty of someone who had spent long months riding roads where ceremony meant nothing and judgment mattered fast. It was in the way he looked at city walls, watchtowers, drainage channels, market congestion, guard patterns, roof lines, weather, and crowd behavior as though all of them were speaking at once, and he meant to hear every word. It was in the way he moved through people without rushing them, and yet somehow still made them part when he needed them to. He had his father's stillness. That was the first thing soldiers noticed. Not the coldness, because there was no true coldness in him unless provoked. The stillness. That unnerving, measured calm that made men around him straighten instinctively before they could explain why. The kind that suggested he was not merely seeing what stood in front of him, but calculating what had happened 3 days before and what might happen 2 hours after he passed through. But he had Grace's eyes. That was what the city noticed. Not because they were the same shape, because of what lived inside them. He listened like she listened, fully, dangerously, without the laziness of rank. People who spoke to the crown prince often left the encounter with the strange, disquieting sense that they had been heard more honestly than they intended and weighed more accurately than they liked. That made him beloved in the wrong way. Wrong, at least, for a court. Hanseong had not been told to adore him. That was the problem. The people did it on their own. They loved him for the flood work done in the rain instead of from pavilion reports. They loved him for dismissing a grain officer in public after hearing 3 widows speak instead of listening first to account books. They loved him because he had spent the last 6 months beyond the capital, not as ornament, but as a force. He had ridden through broken southern roads, sat in provincial halls that smelled of mold and debt and fear, and returned with calluses at the base of his sword hand and enough first-hand knowledge to make the capital's polite lies look suddenly thin. Old kingdoms know how to endure beloved dead kings. They know how to endure harmless young princes. They do not know how to endure a living heir whom the people begin trusting before the court finishes arranging his future. That made Jin dangerous before he said a single word. He entered Hanseong through the south gate beneath formal escort and state banners, but nothing about him felt ceremonial. Even the escort line around him seemed less like a display and more like a necessary accommodation to the fact that the city had leaned too close to watch him pass. Women stood beneath awnings with their sleeves drawn neatly over folded hands and watched from the corners of their eyes. Old men who had lived through too many reigns raised their chins just enough to see him clearly, and then lowered them with the expression of men who had learned long ago not to trust hope and were beginning to fail at that lesson. Children, who understood importance by rhythm long before language, abandoned games in alley mouths and ran barefoot alongside the procession until guards gently pushed them back. Jin saw all of it, not in vanity, not with prince's pleasure, with awareness. He looked once toward the market quarter where dried fish hung in thick, salty rows beneath the eaves, once toward the repaired flood channels that had been widened after the spring disaster, once toward the lower watch station where one sentry had let his posture loosen under crowd pressure. He noticed everything. The captain riding at his left glanced over once and said under breath, You've not stopped surveying since we crossed the outer ridge. Jin did not take his eyes off the street ahead. I've been away too long. The captain almost smiled. 3 months. Long enough. That was the thing with him. He never spoke like a boy proving himself. He spoke like a man already carrying more of the kingdom than the kingdom entirely recognized. Inside the palace walls, anticipation had curdled into strategy long before the crown prince's horse reached the inner court. 3 noble houses had positioned daughters within visible, ceremonial range of the welcoming reception, not openly enough to invite scandal, but clearly enough that any intelligent observer would understand the choreography. Lady Han Su-mi in pale blue and old silver, Lady Min Hyun-ju with the posture of someone trained from childhood to look demure while calculating dynastic angles, and a third, subtler placement from House SEO. Cousin rather than daughter, which in court language often meant they intended to appear modest before moving more aggressively later. 2 senior ministers had already prepared memoranda about the prince's marriage season, not suggestion, season, as though he were a harvest waiting for the proper knife. And 1 foreign envoy from the northern court had arrived with a daughter elegant enough to become a diplomatic noose, if tied correctly. She was seated carefully within the secondary reception line, dressed in soft restraint, every movement educated toward the old fantasy that beauty with enough discipline could become statecraft. The king saw all of it the moment he entered the welcoming hall. Of course he did. He did not speak on it publicly. He rarely wasted words on things that had already betrayed themselves by existing. But Grace, watching from her position beside him, felt the old familiar stillness settle into his shoulders, that lethal quiet that meant he had already begun counting roots, motives, alliances, and how many men in the room were smiling too smoothly because they believed the future could still be negotiated through a woman's body and a prince's obedience. Grace saw it more quietly than he did, but perhaps more completely. She always did. Not only the marriage placements, the way 3 senior ladies in the women's court had grouped themselves to funnel later conversation, the way the foreign envoy secretary had chosen a seat close enough to watch the prince's face during introductions, the way an old ritual scholar from Lord Nam's faction kept glancing not at Jin, but at the king, measuring whether age had softened him enough to let pressure through. Then there was Seorin. Princess Seorin saw all of it in less than a minute and hated almost everyone in the room before the morning ended. At 19, she had long since grown out of the court's fatal mistake of assuming daughters are peripheral until marriage arranges them somewhere useful. Seorin had her mother's elegance sharpened by her father's capacity for cold analysis, and because she had been underestimated by older men since infancy, she had also acquired the dangerous habit of hearing too much before anyone thought to lower their voice. She stood just behind Grace, all impeccable posture and polished stillness, while internally sorting the hall into categories: stupid, dangerous, stupid because dangerous, and women she would never allow anywhere near her brother's future. When the foreign envoy's daughter lowered her eyes with just the right degree of softness during the formal greeting, Seorin leaned the smallest possible fraction toward Grace and murmured, without moving her mouth enough for anyone but her mother to notice, "She blinks like an alliance clause." Grace almost smiled. Almost. The king did not, though something in the line of his jaw suggested he had heard and agreed. Jin entered the hall in full ceremonial rank and made the whole room feel younger by comparison. He bowed correctly, received greetings correctly, spoke with effortless precision to each minister, envoy, and high-ranking family representative in the order required. He neither encouraged nor insulted the women placed in his path. He thanked the houses that had sent prayers during the flood season and returned every expression of admiration with exactly enough politeness to prevent offense and exactly enough distance to prevent hope. That, more than anything, rattled them. He was not arrogant. That would have been easier. He was composed in the way only truly dangerous men are composed, as if his self-command belonged to him and not to the court that wanted to claim credit for shaping it. The first audience moved smoothly enough that even the old enemy houses might have breathed easier if the day had ended there. It did not. The final petition line had already formed when the breach came. At first, no one understood what they were seeing, only that one of the lower attendants in charge of sorting petitions had moved too suddenly near the rear of the line, and that the outer guards had shifted with the reflex of men scenting disorder before the room itself had named it. Then the petitioners parted unevenly, not from courtesy but from impact, and a figure stumbled through the gap. A woman, veiled, travel-worn, half-starved by the look of her. Her outer robe still marked with dried road mud and rain discoloration at the hem. And in both hands she carried a sealed memorial wrapped in oilcloth and tied with an old black and red cord that belonged to a bureau long dead. The Royal Investigation Bureau, or what had once been it. That cord had not been lawfully used in years. The room changed instantly. The guards moved at once. So did Jin. Not because she was beautiful, though later people would remember that she was not in the polished way courtiers prepare beauty, but in the harder, stranger way of women who have crossed too much ground, holding too much truth to remain unmarked by it. Her face beneath the loosened edge of the veil was pale with exhaustion, sharpened by rain and anger, and whatever kind of discipline had gotten her alive this far. And she did not plead. That was what stopped him. Not panic, not theatrics, not the wild desperation of someone crashing a royal audience, because she had lost her sense. She looked like someone who had reached the final possible doorway and already understood that even now, standing before the throne, truth still might not save her. That look made Jin move, before thought finished explaining itself. He took one step down from the audience line just as the nearest petition official lunged, too fast, too sharp, too eager. A real official restraining disorder would have reached for the woman. This man reached for silence. His sleeve flashed metal. Not a ceremonial seal pin. A blade slim enough to vanish inside cloth. Jin caught his wrist before the knife cleared. The impact cracked through the hall like split bamboo. The official gasped. The room froze. The crown prince's grip tightened once, brutal and exact, turning the man's arm just enough that the blade dropped uselessly from half-hidden fingers to the floor below with a sound far louder than steel should make in a hall that stunned. The woman looked up, and in that one suspended beat, Jin saw the whole truth of the moment rearrange itself. This had not been an attempt to restore order. It had not even been an overzealous guard action. It had been murder in public clothing. The man had not tried to stop scandal. He had tried to kill her before she spoke. The guards were on him a heartbeat later. He was dragged backward, twisting, white-faced, trying already to shape his mouth around some explanation that died before it formed, because the king had now risen from the dais, and the look on his face made explanation feel almost insulting. The woman dropped to her knees hard enough that Grace heard the sound even over the gasp spreading through the chamber. Still, she did not let go of the oilcloth packet. Her breathing shook once, then steadied. When she spoke, her voice was rough with road dust, fury, and the effort it had taken not to collapse before reaching this room. "My father," she said, and every ear in the hall bent toward her because her tone had none of a petitioner's softness in it, died proving that the men who failed to kill your father never stopped serving this throne. The room went dead, not quiet, dead. Because there are certain sentences that do not merely fill space. They alter architecture. Grace felt it immediately. The old war rising beneath the polished floorboards again, not as memory now, but as continuation. The king had gone so still, she knew the line had struck where it was meant to. Sioran's face did not change at all. which meant she was already memorizing every person in the hall who looked too shocked in the wrong way. Jin crouched before the woman himself. He did not hand her off, did not signal for a lesser official to take the packet. He held out his hand. "Give it to me!" For one heartbeat she hesitated, not from disobedience, from calculation. Then she placed the memorial bundle into his palm as if she had spent months or years deciding whom to trust it to, and the answer had always depended on whether the boy they had once protected would survive long enough to become this man. The oilcloth was damp at the edges from travel and sweat. The cord old but authentic. The seal impression broken by force and resealed with wax not meant to last another day. Inside was not a memorial. That was the first shock, not an appeal, not accusation arranged for rhetoric, not even a formal petition for royal mercy, a ledger, a working ledger, columns, names, transfer notations, grain diversions, military route codes, port marks, private seals, payments routed through dead channels and living houses, dates spanning years, not old history, ongoing survival. Jin's eyes moved faster as he read. Once, twice, then stopped on a single page longer than the rest. Grace watched the exact second his expression changed, not because she could see the words from where she stood, because she knew that face. It was his father's face when truth stopped being abstract. The king descended from the dais at last. No herald called the movement. No one breathed enough to need one. He came to stand over Jin's shoulder, looked down, read, and for a moment even Grace could not decipher what entered his expression. Not simple rage, not surprise, something older, darker, the recognition of an old enemy's hand in a room that had spent years pretending its ghosts were buried. Jin lifted his gaze slowly. "Your father," he said to the veiled woman. "Who was he?" She answered without lowering her eyes. "Royal Investigator Yoon Se-jin." The name struck the older ministers first. Grace saw it on their faces. Tiny, involuntary flinches, the kind produced not by rumor, but by memory too long denied. Yoon Se-jin, officially dead in a landslide 17 years earlier. Unofficially, one of the last men assigned to follow the financial afterlife of the Queen Dowager's hidden faction before that task mysteriously vanished from every surviving record. Grace felt cold move through her in a clean line, not because the name was unfamiliar, because it fit too well. The woman swallowed once, then added, "He left the records with me when he understood they had already marked him." Her voice did not shake now. "He said they would not matter, while boys still stood where men should be. He said if I ever reached Hanseong alive, I must place them only in the hands of a throne old enough to understand patience, and an heir old enough to understand what patience costs." No one in the hall moved. The crown prince looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment the future changed. Not because love struck him yet, not fully. That came later, but recognition did. The terrible, immediate recognition of one dangerous soul seeing another arrive carrying exactly the kind of truth that can either crown a generation or bury it. The king extended his hand. Jin gave him the ledger. He turned pages, stopped, turned back, read one name twice, then very softly, so softly the whole room had to lean into silence to hear it. He said, "Lord Nam." The name seemed to drop into the hall and keep falling. Lord Nam Gyung-ho, pillar of state, long survivor, measured statesman. A man who had spent 2 decades standing near the throne with the perfect degree of gravity required to make loyalty look effortless and unprovable in equal measure. And now his name sat inside a ledger carried by the daughter of a murdered investigator who had nearly been silenced before speaking in open court. Grace did not look toward Lord Nam immediately. Neither did the king. That was deliberate, merciless, because real power does not always turn first toward the guilty. Sometimes it lets guilt sweat in place. At last the king lifted his head. Seal the hall. The order cracked through the chamber like thunder. Doors barred, guards doubled, scribes commanded into stillness. No one leaves. The women of the inner court drew back. The foreign envoy understood instantly that whatever marriage ambitions had been arranged for the day were now ash. Sioran, standing just behind Grace, exhaled once and murmured under her breath, "So this is how the next war begins." Grace heard her and knew she was right, because a true next-generation saga cannot end with decoration. It must end with reopening. The old war had not died with the Queen Dowager. It had not even truly ended when Grace became queen. It had endured, adapted, changed clothing, learned patience, and waited for the day the boy they feared would return as a man. Now he had, and truth had arrived with him. The king turned finally toward the veiled woman once more. "Your name?" She lifted her chin. Jin held her gaze. And somewhere beneath the hall's terror, beneath the ledger, beneath the guards and the sealed doors and the old names beginning to tremble inside the pages of state memory, something else entered the room quietly enough that no one yet recognized it for what it was. Not love, not yet. Only inevitability. The crown prince of Joseon had returned beloved. And before the day was over, the kingdom had placed in his hands a woman, a ledger, and a buried war all sharp enough to become destiny. Now Hanseong is faced, not with a hunt, not with festival silk, not with ornamental next-generation court life, but with something much stronger. A grown crown prince, returning already too beloved for the kingdom's comfort, a mysterious woman nearly murdered in open court, and proof that the old war against the throne had not died with the Queen Dowager. It had only learned patience. Her name was Yoon Hae-rin. By nightfall, only 6 people in the palace knew it. The king, Grace, the crown prince, Princess Siren, and 2 archivists old enough and loyal enough to understand that certain truths survive only when they are first hidden correctly. That alone told Hae-rin everything she needed to know about the house she had entered. They did not put her in a dungeon. That would have made her a criminal before the story had even chosen its shape. They did not put her in a guest house either. That would have made her visible, which inside a palace was often another way of making a person dead without quite killing them yet. Grace placed her in the Eastern Archive chambers, under her own direct seal. That mattered more than most people in the palace would ever fully understand, because the Eastern Archives were not simply shelves and records. They were memory under guard. They were where dangerous paper came when it needed to become more than rumor, but not yet more than breath. They were where the court could be made to admit that ink has teeth if enough truth survives long enough inside it. And they were where Grace herself had once first become impossible to ignore. Hae-rin understood that almost immediately, not because anyone explained it, because women who survive by carrying truth learn to recognize the shape of serious rooms. The archive chamber was warm but not soft. No ornamental comforts, no false welcome, just ordered shelves, sealed boxes, 2 lamps kept deliberately low, and a long central table where the ledger she had nearly died bringing to court now lay weighted at the corners with carved stone to keep its pages flat. Grace stood at one end of that table in dark silk and studied the young woman without a single wasted word. The crown prince stood opposite her, the king slightly behind, though the entire room bent more around his silence than around any man's position. Princess Siren sat near the side shelf with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of someone who had already decided that this woman's life now mattered to the shape of the kingdom and would therefore listen to every syllable she spoke for weakness, omission, or brilliance. Hae-rin, still travel-worn, still exhausted enough that the edges of the world seemed too sharp beneath the lamplight, did not bow twice. She had already bowed in court. This room asked for truth, not ritual. Grace understood that first. Sit, she said. It was not kindness, not unkindness either. Permission to remain human long enough to speak. Hayren sat. The king remained standing. Your father, he said, with the frightening economy of a man who had lived too long to decorate the entrance to a wound, was royal investigator Yoon Se-jin. Yes, officially dead in a provincial landslide. Yes, and unofficially? Hayren held his gaze. Murdered before he could finish proving that the Queen Dowager's old network survived her fall by hiding itself in grain, shipping, and court respectability. No one in the room moved. The king did not blink. Grace, however, saw the truth of the girl immediately, not in the content of the answer, though that was devastating enough, in the way she said it. No performance, no tearful appeal, no self-protective softening around the ugliest part. That was how Grace knew Hayren was not merely brave. She was disciplined by survival. There is a difference. Hayren began speaking in full only after she drank water, and one of the archivists brought the second ledger box from the lower shelf, the one she had indicated with a glance when Grace asked whether what she carried to court was all of it. It was not. Of course it was not. Truth this large never arrives in a single book if it has survived years of being hunted. Her father, she explained, had begun tracing odd irregularities nearly 2 decades earlier. State grain that vanished into weather loss, only to reappear through private port accounts months later. Military shipments marked degraded but paid in full. Silent subsidies to men long dismissed from palace service. Foreign intermediary houses receiving coin through provincial fronts, too minor to attract sustained attention. Nothing individually grand enough to provoke open war. Everything together forming the kind of hidden web only patient corruption can weave. He had followed it far enough to understand that the purge after the Queen Dowager's confinement had not destroyed the old faction. It had only stripped away its ceremonial clothing. The surviving skeleton had buried itself in respectability. Smaller offices, safer titles, financial channels instead of ritual power, foreign couriers instead of palace women, men who smiled less and lasted longer, and one name, Hayren said, had kept returning wherever the paths converged, but never directly enough to condemn without stronger proof. Lord Nam Gyung-ho. Even in the archive chamber, with no court audience to feed, the name changed the air. The king looked down at the ledger again. Grace watched his hand at the edge of the page. Still, too still, because Lord Nam was not a man you accuse lightly. He had survived the fall of older factions by practicing the art most dangerous in a long political life, never becoming the face of anything too ugly, only the hand just behind it. Respected, controlled, useful in crisis, always grave enough to seem above appetite. He had become one of those men kingdoms produce when they want corruption that dresses itself in dignity rather than silk. And now his name sat not in rumor, not in alley whispers, not in half-remembered servant stories, in ledgers, payments, codes, roots, dates, the kind of evidence worthy of the blow. The crown prince was the first one outside his parents to touch it. That mattered more than anyone said aloud, because Jin did not read the pages like a sheltered heir receiving old history. He read them like a man realizing the kingdom had waited until he grew dangerous enough to understand what it had hidden from him. Hayren noticed that too. Of course she did. She noticed many things. The king's silence was not uncertainty. It was calculation assembling itself into inevitability. Grace's questions were not suspicious in the ordinary sense. They were the questions of a woman who had once entered palace life carrying one form of truth and now wanted to know exactly how far the next truth would reach before deciding where to place her trust. Princess Siren's stillness was the most dangerous of all. It belonged to someone who looked quiet in order to hear what everyone else would reveal once they relaxed around that quiet. And Jin looked at the ledger as if the pages might at any moment stop being paper and become men. That should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, for reasons Hairin was too exhausted and too honest to sentimentalize, it steadied her. Because she had spent half her life carrying danger in silence. And he looked like the first man she had met in years, who might understand that silence is not absence. It is storage. The conversation deepened. Her father had not merely left ledgers, he had left instructions, old routes, archive references. One sealed list of houses never to trust even if they appeared unconnected. And one sentence written at the bottom of a coastal prayer page, in a hand shaky enough to prove he had been running out of time. Hairin remembered it without needing to look. If the names ever become useful, she said, voice low now, not because she was weakening, but because memory does that to even disciplined women. Bring them to the throne only when the heir is old enough to understand what courts do to truth. That line changed the room more than the names had. Grace felt it first, because it meant Yoon Se-jin had not merely distrusted his enemies, he had distrusted timing. He had known the king's youth had been too crowded with old structures, too compromised by proximity to surviving rot, too bound to private grief and public caution to bear a blow of this size cleanly. He had believed instead in the son, in a future prince raised under a different kind of house, a boy who would become a man difficult to educate out of judgment. The king understood the insult and the faith in equal measure. He looked at Jin once after Hairin spoke the sentence. Not long, long enough. Neither father nor son commented on it. Neither needed to. Princess Seorin did. Not aloud. Her eyes moved from Hairin to her brother and back, and in that quiet archiving way of hers, she understood exactly what had entered the palace with the girl. Not just a witness, not just a ledger, not just old names sharpened into new danger. A bond, not yet love, that would have been easier to dismiss as youth if it came too quickly dressed in obvious heat. This was something else, more dangerous, more intelligent. Two people in a room full of truth no one else could yet bear. Jin saw that Hairin had spent half her life surviving by reading danger before it spoke plainly. Hairin saw that Jin had grown into the kind of prince courts pray to shape and dread to fail at shaping. One who could feel deeply without surrendering judgment to feeling. That combination makes a future king either magnificent or impossible to control. Old kingdoms prefer future kings who are neither. Grace noticed it before the king spoke of it. Of course she did. Later that evening, after the first cross-referencing of the ledger had begun, and the archivists were comparing Lord Nam's hidden shipping marks against older grain loss summaries, Hairin stood by the long table translating one coded route notation from coastal shorthand into formal court hand. Jin stood opposite her, too close for ordinary witness questioning, not close enough yet for accusation. He asked, "Why bring it now?" She answered without looking up, "Because your father is feared." "And I am not?" That made her lift her head. The faintest flash of something almost dry crossed her face. "You are," she said, "but not by the same people, for the same reasons." Jin held her gaze. "Which people fear me?" "The ones who know what kind of prince survives being loved and still learns to judge." There was no flirtation in the exchange. That was what made it more dangerous. Grace, standing near the side shelf under the pretext of reviewing seal indices, looked from one to the other and understood at once what kind of fire had just entered the palace. The king saw it too. He said nothing. That night, alone with Grace in the low-lit quiet of their private rooms, long after the crown prince had gone to his own chambers and Seorin had slipped into the women's wing, with the expression of someone already preparing to eavesdrop usefully before dawn. The king stood by the open lattice and looked out into the night. "He looks at her," he said at last, "as though truth has become a woman." Grace sat beside the lamp table, one hand resting lightly on the folded sleeve of the robe she had not yet put away. "And she looks at him," she answered softly, "as though survival has." Neither of them smiled, because both already knew the danger. They had lived long enough to recognize it in another generation before it named itself. And this was where the next generation's saga found its emotional center. Not in court arrangement, not in decorative succession politics, in the oldest and most dangerous thing in royal life, a heart drawn toward the wrong person at the exact moment the kingdom most needs the future to remain orderly. Princess Sioran became crucial here. She was the only one in the family who could move lightly enough through the women's quarters, side courts, and ceremony wings to hear what men in council did not say aloud. Men think themselves safer in rooms where women pour tea and lower their eyes. They have thought that for centuries. It keeps producing daughters like Sioran. By the second morning after Hayren's arrival, Sioran had already learned 3 things. First, the marriage pressure around her brother had accelerated. A northern frontier alliance had reappeared in conversation with suspicious suddenness. A noble daughter from House Han had been praised far too often for her composure in the hearing of the same 3 ladies. And one old family, distantly tied through marriage to Lord Nam's extended kin line, had begun offering phrases like state balancing union and the calming effect of appropriate domestic alignment. Sioran wanted to strangle all of them with embroidery thread. Second, Hayren's arrival had not gone unnoticed. Someone knew a woman had reached the palace. Someone knew the crown prince himself had intervened in open court. And someone had begun searching the lower record rooms for a missing ledger before dawn on the second day, which meant the network already understood exactly what had gone wrong and what object had failed to disappear with her. Third, and this was the one that made Sioran stop and read the note 3 times before deciding whether to bring it straight to Grace or first confirm the secretary's hand. Lord Nam's people were already moving in concert with the foreign envoy's household. The note was small, that was the worst kind, folded twice, passed through a perfumed sleeve, delivered to the wrong corridor because the courier believed a princess lingering by a painted screen was decoration and not threat. Sioran unfolded it in the shadow of the lower corridor and read the line once, then again, then closed her hand over it so tightly the edge bit skin. The message was short. Secure the prince before the girl speaks in full. Marriage first, trial after. Sioran stood very still, not because she was frightened, because she was furious in the most useful possible way. By the time she brought the note into Grace's private chamber that evening, the crown prince was still in the Eastern Archive Hall with Hayren and the 2 trusted archivists, tracing state grain marks against port tax summaries, while the king examined whether the military theft column alone might be enough to open Lord Nam without revealing the whole ledger too soon. Grace took the note, read it, went cold. The king read it next. His face did not change. That was the danger. Then Grace looked toward the door to the archive wing, as if the next room now held not just her son and a witness, but the future cracking open in exactly the shape she had feared from the moment she saw them standing across that ledger from one another. Because the enemy had already decided the answer. Not after debate, not after observing longer, immediately. Bind the prince first. Silence the woman after. The next generation was heading in the direction, not with love declared, not with safety built, not with the soft intoxication of 2 young people catching feelings in a palace story too lazy to understand what danger is, but with something sharper. A woman from buried records becoming the center of the crown prince's attention, Grace and the king recognizing the return of dangerous love in a new generation, and proof that the enemy had already named its strategy before the family had fully named the threat. The war was opening again. Only this time, it was opening around their son. The first rupture between father and son did not come from hatred. It came from timing. That was what made it dangerous. Hatred is easier to understand in a palace, easier to point at, easier to name as enemy feeling, enemy language, enemy intent. But timing can cut two people who love one another almost more cleanly than malice can, because timing belongs to judgment. And judgment, in royal houses, is where love and power most often go to wound each other. The king wanted patience. The crown prince wanted movement. Both were right enough to hurt. The ledger Hayrin brought to court had not merely cracked open an old shadow. It had given shape to something worse, a surviving architecture, grain diversions, military route fraud, buried payments, private trade, retainers kept alive beneath new names and smaller offices, enough to damn a man like Lord Nam only if it could be proven in order, through sequence, witness chains, corroborated records, and legal precision sharp enough to survive open court. The king understood that instinctively. He had learned it in blood and years. He knew what happened when truth struck too early inside a system built to absorb impact and return innocence to the wrong men. Strike too soon, and evidence becomes noise. Strike with the wrong witness, and witnesses die. Strike before every line is tied, and the court survives by calling caution wisdom while the guilty re-emerge under cleaner silk 6 months later. He would not drag his son into a half-made war. Jin, however, had spent the last 2 days looking across archives and court chambers at a woman who had arrived half-hunted into the palace, carrying her dead father's work in oilcloth and rain stains. He had no patience left for men like Lord Nam, sitting upright beneath titles and age and state dignity, while girls like Hayrin nearly bled out in open court trying to reach the throne with what they had buried for half their lives. He was not reckless. That was what made him so dangerous, and he was decisive. And decisiveness in a future king looks very different to the people who once hoped to own his caution. A reckless man can be dismissed. A passionate fool can be trapped. But a prince who sees quickly, loves deeply, and still thinks clearly enough to act before other men finish arranging their excuses. That kind of air makes old systems breathe wrong. The court felt it. Of course it did. Which was why, instead of slowing under danger, the marriage pressure intensified. The foreign envoy's proposal became formal by the next morning. Not merely a daughter placed in graceful view now, but a sealed declaration of interest couched in all the old diplomatic language of harmony, regional balance, and future prosperity. House Han moved just as fast, presenting a lineage packet so heavy with ancestral proof it practically smelled of old paper and female obedience. One of the court widows attached to the ritual wing began referring to the prince's season aloud in the women's halls, as though Jin were not a living man, but a field the kingdom had earned the right to harvest. Grace heard every one of these movements by noon. Sioran heard more. The king needed no reports at all. Pressure of that kind announces itself through architecture, through who enters which hall too often, through who begins smiling at the wrong moment, through which old men suddenly discover concern for continuity precisely when they feel the ground moving beneath their old arrangements. Jin endured the first 2 days of it almost perfectly. That unsettled them further. He received the foreign memorial with correct gratitude and no invitation. He allowed the Han genealogical document to be read in summary and returned without comment. He bowed to the ritual widows. He thanked the elders. He neither encouraged nor insulted. But the more he behaved with composure, the more the court felt the shape of something harder beneath it. He was not being led. He was choosing not to move. That is a very frightening thing for people who mean to arrange a prince's future. The first real public crack came in open court. It was a minor session by royal standards, one of those broad administrative hearings where taxation, irrigation, military readiness, and ceremonial burdens all crowd into the same long, airless stretch of official time. The king presided. Jin stood in attendance at the secondary position to his right. Lord Nam was present, of course, grave and immaculate as ever. And toward the latter half of the hearing, when state grain had been discussed enough to lull less intelligent men into thinking the dangerous part of the morning had passed, one ritual scholar attached to the marriage council bowed and requested permission to speak on the question of the crown prince's future domestic stabilizing obligations. The whole room recognized the pretext immediately. The king gave him permission anyway. That was often the worst thing he could do to a fool. The scholar, old enough to know better and vain enough to forget it, spoke in the polished rot of men who have spent too long dressing appetite in moral language. He spoke of the importance of timely union, of how futures grow unstable when affections are left without proper channel, of the need to protect future kings from emotional entanglements unsuited to the weight of the throne. And then, with all the smooth confidence of someone who believed himself safely abstract, he said, "A future king's affections, if left unconstrained too long, can begin mistaking danger for destiny." The room held. The phrase hung there, silk smooth and ugly. It had not named Heirin. It did not need to. It named the idea of her, the danger of her, the accusation that a prince might be moving not by discernment, but by feeling. The kind of sentence old courts use when they wish to attack a woman through the man not yet permitted to defend her openly. Jin turned his head and looked directly at the scholar. No visible anger, no wounded pride, only that calm stillness of his father's, sharpened by the faster fire he had taken from his mother. Then he said, in front of half the council and all the scribes, "Then it would seem destiny has a better eye than some men." The room nearly died where it sat. One clerk actually dropped his brush. The scholar froze as though the answer had struck him physically. Across the chamber, Lord Nam did not move at all, which was how Grace, hearing the account later from Seorin and 3 separate servant lines, knew he had understood instantly that the emotional war had just become public. The king did not rebuke Jin in the hall. That would have been too revealing, too useful to the wrong people. He only said, with deadly evenness, "The council will return to irrigation matters." No one in the room was thinking about irrigation after that. By sunset, Hanseong had the line. Women in the upper markets repeated it with secret delight. Men in tea houses repeated it with warning. Younger officers repeated it admiringly. Older ministers repeated it as evidence that the crown prince's affections had become visible enough to threaten protocol. The phrase spread because it was perfect, cutting, princely, and dangerous precisely because it had not denied the accusation. It had elevated it. Grace saw the danger in it immediately, not because her son loved wrongly, because now the court knew he loved at all, and love, when visible in a future king, becomes something the palace begins trying to cage before the man himself fully decides what shape he will give it. The king confronted him that night, not in the council chamber, not publicly, not with witnesses enough to make the argument performative. He sent for Jin to come to the western inner chamber attached to the late queen's old residence, where so many truths in this family had first been spoken too plainly to survive pretense afterward. Grace was already there when Jin arrived. That mattered. The king had not summoned her as ornament or comfort. He had summoned her because some conversations in royal families must not be allowed to harden into father-son myth without the woman at the center of their truth standing witness. Jin entered in dark court robes not yet changed for the night. The line of his shoulders was too controlled, his face too quiet. He bowed correctly to the king, then to Grace. The king did not tell him to sit. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then the king said, You will not force me to choose between destroying Lord Name too early and letting the court think you may be baited into open defiance by feeling. There it was. Not a father's plea, a ruler's warning. Jin took that blow without flinching. His answer came sharp, but not childish. This, he said, from the man who changed the kingdom for love? The room changed instantly. Grace felt it before either of them moved. There it was. The old family wound. Not because father and son hated one another, because the son had just reached for the exact place where history hurt most and used it as argument. The king went very still. That was always dangerous. Not because stillness meant loss of control, because it meant control so complete that feeling was now being armored rather than spoken. Jin took one step further into the room. You taught this palace that love does not weaken the throne, he said, voice controlled now but burning underneath. You taught the crown prince not to let the court educate him out of his heart. You taught me that fear dressed as ritual is still fear. His gaze held the king's with unnerving steadiness. Now I stand where you once stood, and you ask me to wait while they prepare chains. The king's face hardened, not into cruelty, but into pain made formal. I ask you, he said, not to mistake fire for strategy. Jin almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Fire, he said. A woman arrives carrying the names of the men who kept the old corruption alive under your reign and your father's. She is nearly killed in open court. Marriage nets close around me before the ink on her father's ledgers has dried under your seal. And this is fire? His voice dropped lower. No, this is timing. Theirs. The king took one step forward then. Grace moved before either man could go another. Not because she feared violence, because she feared something worse, that two men who loved each other deeply and resembled one another too clearly would suddenly stop hearing truth because both felt too seen in the wrong place. She came between them, not physically separating, only enough to change the geometry of the room. And because she was Grace, she did not soothe them. She told the truth. You are both speaking from fear. Her husband looked at her. Her son looked at her. Neither liked being seen that precisely. That was how she knew she had found the center. You, she said to Jin, turning toward him first, fear that caution will become surrender. You hear patience, and remember every old palace delay that ever ended in a woman being buried under procedure. His jaw tightened. He did not deny it. Grace turned to the king. And you fear that his courage will cost him what courage once nearly cost you. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut, because the king did not deny that either. The room held all three of them inside that truth. Father, mother, son, not enemies, not even opponents. Three people who understood the cost of palace timing from three different generations of wound. The king looked away first, though only for a breath. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less formal, more dangerous because it was closer to naked honesty. Lord Nam cannot be struck on ledger alone, he said. Not yet. Not without opening the whole court too soon and letting half the evidence vanish into honorable confusion before dawn. Jin answered instantly. Then move on the witnesses. We are. Faster. The king's eyes snapped back to him. Do you think I do not understand speed? Jin's answer came quieter now, which somehow made it hit harder. I think, he said, you understand how long a woman can be left standing near danger while men discuss sequence. That one nearly broke the room, because it was true enough to wound and unfair enough to enrage in the same breath. He was not only speaking of Hayren now, he was speaking of Grace's old story too, of what the palace had once done to women, by timing truth until blood and love both became negotiable. The king's voice went low. Do not use your mother as weapon against me. Jin did not move. I am using history. Grace shut her eyes briefly, not because either of them was wrong, because both were right in ways that made rightness itself almost unbearable. No resolution came that night. That was why the matter stays strong. Love does not become flatter because it survives. Sometimes it becomes more dangerous because survival has made each person's fear more intelligent. By the time the chamber finally fell quiet enough for words to stop, the family had not healed the rupture. They had only named it, which, in royal houses, is often the first honest mercy available. Jin left. He bowed to Grace more deeply than to the king. Not out of insult. Out of gratitude and pain too mixed to separate. The king did not call him back. Grace stood in the chamber for a long moment after the door closed behind her son. Then she turned toward her husband. "You heard him." The king's face had gone remote again. "Yes." "And?" He exhaled once through his nose, bitter and tired. "And he hears ghosts where I hear traps." Grace looked at him very carefully. Perhaps because the ghost and the trap still use the same language. That landed. It always did when she placed truth exactly. The issue came before dawn, not with fanfare, not with public drama, with law. Grace woke to the subtle wrongness that only palace life teaches people to hear. The faint movement of guards in corridors not meant for routine rotation, the sharper tread of state boots rather than household ones, the whispered exchange outside the archive wing that carried no domestic cadence at all. She was out of bed before the second sound. By the time she reached the Eastern Archive Hall, with one lamp-bearing attendant and 3 silent guards at her back, the seizure was already being done. Not dragged publicly, not violently, cleanly, efficiently, officially. State guards stood at the chamber threshold with a sealed warrant in hand. Rin, pale but upright, had already been ordered from the table. One archivist was being held aside under procedural silence. The other had gone white enough to show just how lawful the whole thing appeared on its surface. The crown prince was there too. He must have moved as quickly as she had the instant word reached him. The warrant was being read when Grace entered. The charges were almost elegant in their malice. Introduction of forged materials into royal evidence, conspiracy with foreign intermediaries to destabilize succession order, possible falsification of sealed trade ledgers for court manipulation. The signature at the bottom was legal. That was what made the moment so dangerous. Not false exactly, not in the way a clumsy forgery is false. Legal, real seal, real office, real authority being used at the wrong hour for the wrong reason. The timing was not. Jin understood that at once. Grace saw it on his face. Not the reckless fury the court liked to imagine in young princes under emotional strain, but something more controlled, and therefore more terrifying. He stepped closer to the warrant holder and said very evenly, "Who ordered this before sunrise?" The captain bowed correctly. "By authority of the Ministry of Judicial Verification pending full examination." "And why?" Jin asked. Was the crown prince not informed before a witness tied to open court evidence was removed from the royal archive under state accusation? No answer came fast enough. Because the answer was obvious, they had moved at the only hour available to them, before the king could gather sequence, before Grace could reposition the witness, before the crown prince could decide whether to obey, resist, or make his love visible enough to become scandal. Take the woman, taint the evidence, force the heir either into obedience or spectacle. The palace had always preferred to kill with paperwork before resorting to blood. Rin stood straight even now, though the night had taken whatever color remained in her face. She looked at Jin once, not pleading, not asking rescue, only telling him, with her eyes alone, that she understood exactly what game had just begun. And that was what decided it. Not formally, not aloud, but in the private place where choices become identity. Jin took the warrant from the captain's hand and read it once, then again, then folded it carefully, too carefully. Grace felt the whole chamber tighten, because now the prince was no longer merely angry. He was deciding what kind of man he was under real pressure. The next generation's saga was getting intense. Not with a kiss, not with a confession, not with decorative romantic suffering, but with something much more explosive. Father and son finally colliding in the open over love, timing, and power. Grace standing in the center trying to keep truth from becoming fracture, and the woman carrying the buried war seized before dawn under the exact kind of law the palace had always preferred when it wanted to kill without blood. Now the crown prince would have to decide what kind of man he was under such intense pressure. Once Hayren was taken, the court moved with the speed peculiar to people who know they have only a narrow window before truth reorganizes itself against them. That was the first thing Grace understood. The second was worse. They were not moving in panic. They were moving in sequence. That meant planning. It meant readiness. It meant men and women in silk had already spent too many quiet evenings imagining this exact opportunity. The dangerous girl removed under law, the ledger clouded by accusation, the crown prince made emotionally visible at the worst possible moment, and the kingdom invited to conclude that what stood before it was not buried treason returning through evidence, but a future king too stirred by a suspicious woman to think clearly. By mid-morning, the foreign marriage proposal had been advanced. Not just discussed, as advanced. The envoy's daughter, who had until now remained a carefully placed possibility, was suddenly invited into closer ceremonial range, given access to a luncheon she had not earned, and described by 3 separate old women as possessing the right serenity for complicated seasons. House Han moved just as quickly, circulating lineage notes and whispered reassurances that one of their daughters had the kind of composure that stabilizes great men without claiming to lead them. Grace heard that one through the women's wing and felt her whole body go cold. Stabilizes great men. As if the crown prince were already half lost to feeling, and the kingdom now needed to rescue him through proper female management. Lord Nam's faction began speaking in one voice. That was how Grace knew how far the plan reached. Not all at once, not openly, never in the crude language of conspiracy, but through that old court instinct of harmonized concern, stability, succession, timing, the tragic necessity of protecting the future throne from women tied to old treason networks, the sorrowful burden of ensuring that a prince beloved by the people is not led by dangerous attachment into moral compromise. The phrases arrived polished. That was what made them obscene. They were not merely arresting Hayren. They were rewriting the emotional meaning of the crisis. A dangerous woman. A future king too stirred by sympathy. A father king forced to choose order over attachment. The crown prince understood the trap instantly. Grace did too. The king understood something worse. He understood that this was no longer only about the girl, or the ledger, or Lord Nam's network. The trap had been designed to cut deeper than evidence. If managed correctly, it could do what old factions had failed to do through poison, marriage pressure, and child stealing. It could make his son believe that the throne, his throne, the one rebuilt through so much blood and love and refusal, would always choose structure over truth if pressed hard enough. That was the line the king had once feared in his own youth, the old line, the one where duty becomes indistinguishable from emotional abandonment if wielded by the wrong hands. Now it was returning through his son. Prince Jin did not come to the noon meal. That by itself meant almost nothing. Crown princes in turbulent court seasons are often pulled by counsel, officers, correspondence, military review, or the 1,000 exhausting obligations designed to teach future rulers that time belongs first to the throne. But when the tray returned untouched from the outer chamber, and the attendant confessed, too late and too carefully, that His Highness had not remained long enough even for tea, Grace set her spoon down and did not pick it up again. The king noticed. Of course he did. He had eaten almost nothing either. By late afternoon, Jin had still not spoken to either of them privately. He attended what was required. He stood where ceremony demanded. He answered when addressed. He looked from a distance, almost disturbingly composed. That was exactly what frightened Grace. She knew that look. It was not obedience, not acceptance. The kind of dangerous stillness men inherit when anger has stopped asking permission to become action. Princess Siren noticed it too. She crossed the outer reading court at dusk and said to Grace without preamble, "He is deciding something." Grace lifted her gaze from the sealed report she had not really been reading. What kind of something? Siren's expression did not change. The kind men in our family always decide quietly right before the palace regrets underestimating them. That was more answer than comfort. The king heard about Hyren's transfer before sunset. Not officially. The official version had not yet been arranged into acceptable rhythm. He learned it through timing because no palace can hide movement from a man who has survived it long enough. The guard shift in the judicial corridor changed too early. A transport carriage was ordered readied under ritual screen cover instead of open legal escort. A physician attached to quarantine inspection was summoned without cause. 3 lower clerks were told to remain after bell, and a judicial clerk asked, with far too much casualness, whether the old river route to the northern state residences had been restored after the spring rains. The king heard all of that and knew. By the time the first covert confirmation reached him, he was already standing in the old queen's chambers, with both hands braced on the central table, as though force of stillness alone might keep the room from splitting. Grace entered without being announced. No one announced her to him in rooms like this anymore. He did not look up immediately. That frightened her more than seeing him furious would have, because it meant he was holding the whole weight of the thing inside calculation, and there are moments when calculation can begin to resemble despair if left in a room too long without witness. "You know what he thinks," he said. Grace stood by the lamp table, one hand resting on the carved wood. "Yes." The king lifted his head then. Not quickly, as if even that small motion cost something. "He thinks I'm about to become the man this throne always wanted." The sentence entered the room like cold, not because it was exaggerated, because it was exact. Grace crossed to him slowly. The years between them moved with her. The court, the old letters, the nursery, the son they had fought to keep human, the daughter they had brought into the world beneath the threat of knives disguised as women's rights. Everything. She stopped before him. "And are you?" The king looked at her then, really looked, as if the question itself were the edge of a blade, and he had no right to answer it carelessly. "No," he said. The answer was immediate, too immediate to be performance. Grace touched his face, not to comfort, to anchor. "Then do not fight your son like a king first," she said softly. "Fight beside him like the father who once swore he would not let the palace teach another boy your loneliness." The words entered him hard. She saw it, not in tears, not in weakness, in the smallest fracture of that terrible control men like him survive by, because she had placed truth where truth did not flatter him, only save him if he let it. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his hand came up over hers. "Do you know," he said, voice gone lower now, stripped of audience and rank, "what happens if I move like a father first and cannot prove the whole wound?" Grace held his gaze. "Yes," he went on, "they will call it weakness, then indulgence, then corruption of judgment by blood, and by the time I break their mouths for saying it, half the court will have already taught Jin that his father chose him over the law, not because the law had been poisoned." Grace did not look away. "And if you move like a king first?" The question needed no completion. The king's jaw tightened. Then he may believe the law still matters to me more than the human being inside it. There it was, the whole terror of the matter. Not whether father and son loved one another. That was never in question. Whether a kingdom built on old manipulations could force them into postures that made love look like betrayal from the wrong angle. Grace lowered her hand from his face to his chest. Not lightly, not romantically, exactly over the place where he carried too much. Then do not let them choose the angle. The king shut his eyes once, only once. When he opened them again, something had steadied. Not resolved, steadied. That same night, Princess Siren became the turning key of the plot. While the court watched her brother and father, it underestimated her again. That was the sort of mistake clever men make about royal daughters right before their houses collapse. Sioran moved through the palace as she always did when danger sharpened, elegantly, invisibly, and with enough polite stillness to make old women speak too freely around her. She visited the women's wing on the excuse of checking on Hayren's confiscated effects for archive transfer. She passed through the lower judicial corridor as though looking for a misplaced embroidery ledger. She stood long enough near the ritual chapel annex to hear a clerk complain that temporary quarantine protocols were being revived for no good reason after sunset. And because she had spent years learning how lies move when dressed as household procedure, she followed every one of those sounds backward. What she found by midnight changed everything. Hayren's trial was never meant to happen fully, not in open form, not in any meaningful hearing. She was to be transferred before first light to a remote state residence under ritual quarantine doctrine, one of those old legal burial grounds where inconvenient women, tainted evidence, and politically awkward illnesses go when the court wishes them to disappear with paperwork instead of blood. Once moved, Hayren could vanish legally, or confess whatever the court wrote for her, or die of regulated obscurity while the crown prince's betrothal proceeded and the kingdom sighed in relief that youthful danger had been tidied. Sioran read the transfer note once in the dark and felt her stomach turn to iron. When she brought the information to Grace, she did not sit. "They mean to bury her before sunrise," she said. Grace went still. The king, standing near the inner screen where one of his most trusted captains had just finished reporting on the night guard rotation, looked at Sioran as if he could see the entire trap finally lit from below. "Where?" he asked. Sioran laid the copied route strip onto the table. North River Road first, then the Eastern Quarantine House beyond the old shrine line. The king knew the place. Of course he did. Every palace graveyard for unwanted truth has its echo in a king's memory whether he wishes it there or not. Grace looked toward the door at once. "My son." The king was already moving, but too late. Not too late for everything. Too late to keep the next thing from beginning. Jin had vanished, not into rebellion, into action. His assigned outer guard, when dragged into the inner chamber white-faced and shaking, could report only what intelligent men in royal service hate reporting most, that nothing loud had happened, no struggle, no visible breach. His Highness had remained in his chamber long enough for routine certainty to grow around the assumption that he remained there. Then, sometime between second and third watch, the inner screen had been found open, the rear passage latch disturbed, and the prince's lighter riding cloak missing from its peg. One horse was gone from the lesser west stable. 2 maps, 1 judicial route packet, a travel lamp, no ceremonial escort. Grace shut her eyes. The king did not, because the king had already understood exactly what kind of son they had raised. Not a boy who would vanish because emotion undid him. A man who would move when he concluded the palace meant to use law to kill truth and expected him to stand still for the dignity of being managed. By dawn, the palace believed the worst. The crown prince had left his guard line. The accused woman was no longer in secure holding. And the future king now looked to anyone eager enough, dangerously close to treason through love. That was exactly what Lord Nam wanted. Not just the girl disappeared. The prince emotionally compromised, the father forced into a visible choice, the whole royal house made to look unstable under pressure from a woman and a ledger. The dawn air in the outer court was pale and hard when the final confirmation reached the king. Hairin's transfer carriage had been intercepted before the first bridge station, not attacked by bandits, not redirected by state counterorder, seized cleanly. The escort survivors spoke of mounted figures moving too fast and too well for random men. One had carried the crown prince's secondary training blade. Another had used palace hand signs before striking the lanterns. Grace stood beneath the covered outer walk with Seorin beside her and watched the king read the abandoned escort route map in silence. Around them, the whole palace seemed to hold itself one breath away from panic. Ministers were waking, clerks were beginning to hear. Attendants were carrying the wrong trays to the wrong halls because fear had already entered the walls. And everyone, though no one yet dared say it too loudly, was waiting for one thing. Would the king move as father or as ruler? He lowered the route map very slowly, looked once toward the eastern ridge beyond the palace roofs, where dawn had just begun burning the clouds pale. Then he turned to the guard captain. When he spoke, his voice was so cold even the guards lowered their eyes. "Find my son before the court does." The order rang through the corridor like judgment, not because he was sparing Jin consequences, but because he understood exactly what would happen if the court reached him first. A prince moved by love, a witness removed from a legal holding, a father king who had once broken tradition for marriage, now suddenly facing the accusation that he had raised a son unable to separate desire from state. That story, if the wrong men told it first, would poison half the kingdom before noon. Grace heard the whole shape of that in the order. Find my son before the court does, not arrest him, not denounce him, not bring him down in chains before the council could feast on the spectacle. Find him. Before the palace changed his movement into a weapon against him. And that was the situation Hanseong was faced with. Not with a pretty forbidden romance, not with juvenile rebellion dressed up as passion, not with a prince running because he had lost command of himself, but with something much more serious. A next-generation love story pushed fully into palace war. Grace and the king finding each other again at the exact moment they most needed to stand as one. Princess Seorin revealing the enemy's deeper design with the intelligence the court kept underestimating, and the crown prince vanishing into the night with the woman the kingdom had already decided must destroy him. Now the future king was no longer being discussed. He was moving. The palace called it disappearance. That was the first lie. It was a useful word, a respectable one, the kind of word men choose when they need something to sound disorderly without sounding purposeful. Disappearance suggested impulse, recklessness, youth, a prince undone by feeling, a woman gone from a lawful holding, an embarrassing breach in household discipline, something unfortunate, something emotional, something small enough to be absorbed, explained, and eventually filed into the kingdom's long cabinet of nearly dangerous things. The truth was more complicated. Prince Jin had not fled the throne. He had gone to stop the palace from burying a woman and the truth she carried under procedural darkness. With the help of one loyal guard captain and information fed quietly through Seorin's network, he intercepted Hairin's transfer before it cleared the outer ritual road. He did not ride at the head of rebels. He did not gather youthful officers or dramatic sympathizers. He did not make speeches to men eager for a prince's anger to become their faction. He rode like the man he was becoming, precise, furious, already too royal for his own good. The escort had barely reached the old shrine road when his line cut across them from the lower ridge. Lanterns extinguished first. Led horse turned. rear wheel locked, the warrant chest seized before the transfer captain could decide whether he had been intercepted by thieves, traitors, or the future king himself. 2 guards were disarmed. 1 clerk fled and was caught. Hae-rin, still bound under formal accusation and confusion, was pulled from the covered carriage not into wilderness, not into barracks, not into some reckless armed camp that would have made the court's lie easier, but into an abandoned archive shrine once used for sealed state storage. That choice mattered. It proved everything and nothing at once. Everything, because it made clear Jin was not trying to crown himself through crisis. He had not taken her to soldiers, or border camps, or men who might love a prince enough to mistake defiance for legitimacy. He had taken her to records, to paper, to an old house of memory where documents once went when the state still feared ink enough to hide it. Nothing, because Lord Nam understood instantly how to twist even that choice if given the wrong audience first. The emergency council was his first move. Of course it was. By the time the dawn reports reached the inner ministries, Lord Nam had already arrived in dark state robes and grape-shaped composure, urging immediate assembly on the grounds of succession disturbance. He did not call Jin a traitor. Not yet. Men like him know when a word must ripen before it is spoken. Instead, he spoke of air instability, of emotional compromise, of the tragedy that may befall even the most beloved princes when private feeling outruns lawful judgment. He said, with all the carefully weighted sorrow of a man trying to make poison sound paternal, that a future king who absconds with an accused woman under armed conditions may already be proving the danger of ungoverned feeling. Grace nearly had him destroyed with her eyes alone. She stood beside the king on the lesser dais, hearing every syllable, her face so still that only those who loved her truly would have recognized how close she stood to something colder than fury. Her daughter sat at her side in unnatural silence. The crown prince's place remained empty. The whole court could feel the shape of it. Lord Nam continued, because men like him rarely understand when they have already spoken once too often. The realm, he said, must be protected not only from old treason, but from the possibility that noble compassion in the air may be weaponized by those who understand his heart better than his office. There it was, not law, not grief, the insult beneath them both. Grace's hands remained folded in her sleeves. The king did something smarter than rage. He did not rise to the bait. He did not send troops openly into the roads where half the court would watch whether he moved as father or sovereign and build a story from whatever choice looked easiest to misread. He sent only the men who had once guarded Grace in the earliest days, men old enough now to have iron in their bones and very little vanity left in the parts of themselves that followed orders, men trained not to humiliate fear into rebellion, men who knew the difference between arresting a criminal and approaching a prince who had moved for reasons a father might understand too well. Then he went himself. He left the court before Lord Nam could finish arranging his moral concern into a second speech. No royal flourish, no public explanation, only one sentence to the guard captain. Hold the council, no one leaves. Then he was gone. Grace did not follow. That mattered too. Not because she did not want to, because she understood exactly what sort of meeting now had to happen and knew that sometimes women who have shaped men through truth do not need to stand in the room for that truth to remain between them. She remained at the palace center instead, holding it, reading it, listening to the lower motions around Sioran's silent intelligence and her daughter's sharpened watchfulness, keeping the royal house from fracturing outward while father and son moved toward the place where the real wound waited. The abandoned archive shrine stood in a neglected belt of old state ground, east of the lower river and above the disused records road, where damp stone and half-wild cedar roots had spent years reclaiming a building the court no longer bothered to remember unless it needed old paper hidden from newer eyes. The roof line sagged in one place. The courtyard pool had gone green-black under neglect. Moss tracked the joints between the paving stones, and inside, beneath the smell of dust and rain-soaked timber, the room still carried the faint, dry scent of old paper and sealed knowledge. That was where Jin waited. Hayrin sat near an archive chest with one lantern burning low beside her, pale but unbroken. The bindings on her wrists were gone. One of the crown prince's loyal guards stood near the side entrance, sword lowered but ready. Another watched the outer path through the split lattice. No one spoke when the king entered. For a long moment the room held only the sound of damp dripping from the eaves. Jin stood between Hayrin and the entrance, sword sheathed but hand near it. Not because he meant to strike his father, not because he had chosen rebellion, but because the whole kingdom had forced them into a posture they should never have had to take. The king stopped 3 paces inside. His guards remained back. He looked first at the chest, then at Hayrin, then fully at his son. You chose a shrine instead of a barracks. Jin held his gaze. Yes. Why? Because I am not building a faction. There it was. The first truth that broke the false story. No accusation, no defensive speech. Only that. The king stepped farther inside. The air between them altered, not because danger lessened, because now the room had begun telling the truth about itself. Hayrin understood it immediately and lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in the private wisdom of someone who knows when history is happening in a family and not directly to her for one breath. Jin spoke first after that. They were going to erase her. The king did not pretend uncertainty. Yes. And if I had waited? The answer did not come dressed in comfort. You might have lost her. Jin's jaw tightened once. His hand left the sword hilt, though not by much. Then why? He said. And now the deeper thing had surfaced beneath the immediate crisis. Did you wait when you knew they were moving? That question was not really about Hayrin. Both men knew it. It was about years, methods, the cost of ruling, the fear that kings always arrive too late because they have too much to hold, too much to weigh, too many innocent faces to protect from consequences. No clean decision survives. The king understood all of that in the silence before answering. He understood, too, that if he gave his son a polished answer here, some part of the bond between them might harden in the wrong place for years. So he answered with the deepest honesty he had yet given him. Because I have spent my life learning that if I strike too soon, he said, voice low enough that the whole shrine seemed to lean toward it, truth dies with the wrong body, and the survivors inherit innocence. The words settled heavily. Then he added after a beat, and because I was afraid that if I moved as father first, you would never again trust the king and me. That changed Jin's face, not fully, not all at once, but enough. Pain entered first, then recognition, then anger losing some of its heat, because at last the deeper motive had been named, and it was not the easy thing he had been bracing himself to despise. Jin looked away for one breath, toward the rain-marked screen, then back. And I, he said, after a long silence, was afraid that if I obeyed as prince first, I would become the kind of son who lets the throne teach him whom to abandon. The king went very still. That was the wound. The real one. Not rebellion, inheritance. Grace had been right. They were both fighting the same ghost from opposite sides. The conversation did not become soft after that. It became true. And true is often more dangerous. The king spoke of speed the way only a man bruised by decades of palace consequence can speak of it. He had seen too much of court timing to trust movement without sequence. He knew how men like Lord Nam built exits into public chaos, and then walked through those exits carrying other people's reputations on their backs like cloaks. Strike badly, and evidence scatters. Strike publicly before the channels are sealed, and half the network vanishes into honorable retirement, while the surviving court begins calling lawlessness what it tolerated in quiet when it served them. Jin heard all of it, and still he answered from the place in him that had been sharpened not by inexperience, but by love and judgment meeting too cleanly to separate. "I have seen too much of palace speed," he said, "to trust delay." The king's gaze narrowed. "That is not the same thing." "No," Jin said, "it is worse." The king took that like a blow, because it was not the language of childish defiance. It was the language of a man already old enough to name exactly what kind of system had shaped his family. Jin stepped once toward the center of the room, not challenging, clarifying. "You say you needed sequence," he said, "but sequence is what they use too. They sequence women into silence, sequence witnesses into distance, sequence evidence into dust, sequence outrage, until it becomes memory, and memory until it becomes a story told by the wrong mouths." He looked once toward Hae-rin, then back to his father. "I would rather die as a man who chose rightly than live as an heir who let the truth be buried at his feet." That sentence almost broke the king, because it was the sentence of his own youth returned sharpened, not repeated, refined by another generation's clearer inheritance of pain and courage. The king said nothing for several seconds, then quietly, "And if your right choice had opened the throne to collapse?" Jin's answer came just as quietly. "Then at least it would not collapse over the body of a woman I watched them take while I stood still and called it discipline." That landed where no ceremonial argument could protect either of them. For a long moment, father and son stood looking at one another across everything they had inherited and everything they still feared becoming. Then the king did the one thing neither the court nor Lord Nam would ever have predicted. He stepped fully into the shrine, not as ruler confronting a rogue heir, not as father surrendering judgment, as both. The guards outside shifted, did not enter. That was important, because some scenes in dynastic life must be seen only by those whose blood and loyalty have earned the sight of them. The king came close enough now that no lie in the room could breathe easily. "If I had come here through force," he said, "what would you have done?" Jin answered honestly, "I don't know." The king absorbed that. Good. An easier answer would have been worse. Then he asked, "And now?" Jin looked at Hae-rin, at the ledger chest, back to his father. "Now I wait," he said, "but not because they were right." The king's mouth tightened by the smallest degree. "Good," he said, "because they were not." It was not forgiveness, not absolution. Something more useful. Recognition. The family rejoined at dawn, not ceremonially, not publicly. Grace stood in the side receiving court under the low gray wash of morning when the king returned with Jin, Hae-rin, the ledger chest, and the men who had ridden with him. Princess Seorin was already there. She had not slept. Her hair remained perfectly ordered anyway, which was how Grace knew how furious she had become in the night. Their daughter hovered just beyond the threshold, old enough now to understand fear without yet being required to make it look like composure. Hae-rin was brought not to confinement, but into the queen's direct household protection. That alone signaled to anyone intelligent enough to understand palaces that the war had just entered its final shape. Grace herself took Hae-rin across the threshold of the protected inner chamber. No proclamation, no dramatic declaration. Just the queen, opening her own household to the woman the court had already tried to bury twice under different names. Jin saw that, and in his face, Grace read the exact moment some part of the previous night's fracture began, if not healing, then at least rejoining under the right pressure. Then Princess Seorin delivered the final weapon. She had spent the night tracing the foreign marriage network through the envoy's side records, the lower dowry inventories, the movement of gifts no one had yet officially accepted, and the private correspondence routes Old men always assume daughters do not understand because daughters have so often pretended not to. What she found was worse than Lord Nam's current manipulations. It was continuity. A Regency-style advisory bloc had been taking shape quietly around the assumption that the king's age, the crown prince's popularity, and the old house's collective fear could eventually be turned into something more elegant than coup and more enduring than simple marriage pressure. Debt, foreign trade leverage, marriage alignment, advisory authority layered through private treaties, and tribute obligations. If Jin could be bound early enough, through the right marriage, the right council voices, the right external obligations, then the next reign might be owned before accession, rather than fought over afterward. Hayren's father had uncovered it years earlier. The same network that once survived the Queen Dowager's fall now meant to survive the king by owning his son. It was never about a dangerous woman alone. It was about who would control the next reign. Sioran laid the copied evidence on the table in the queen's side chamber, while the dawn was still blue at the edges. "This is what they wanted from him," she said, eyes on her brother. "Not obedience. Structure around him before he understood the shape of the cage." Jin went very still. The king looked not at the documents first, but at Sioran. There was pride in his face then, and fury, both deserved. Grace felt the whole story tightening. The enemy's final move would have to come now. Not later. Not after this much had been seen too clearly. And it came through Bled, because stories like theirs at this level need one last violent turn. The day had barely lifted into full morning when Sioran left the side chamber to carry one copy of the foreign letter to the archive ward for sealing and another to the king's judicial table under guard. She refused an escort larger than 2 women and 1 guard captain because she had spent too many years inside the palace watching larger escorts attract more eyes than they protected from. Grace almost called her back. Almost. That nearly undid her later. What happened was swift enough to leave the whole house gasping behind it. Not vanished into nowhere. Not snatched in some theatrical alley of fate. Taken in motion between the women's wing and the queen's chamber by men who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what she had become to the family's center. The first sign was not a scream. It was the absence of one. Sioran was too disciplined to scream first. She fought. That was why the guard found 1 broken hairpin on the stone. A torn silk edge caught against the side lattice. A servant unconscious at the corridor bend. And blood? Not much. Not enough for death, but enough to say the princess had not gone quietly, and someone else had paid for assuming she would. The copied foreign letter was gone with her. By the time the alarm reached the king, the whole chamber changed shape. Grace did not sit, did not weep, did not call for gods or physicians or comfort. She rose, and every person in that room felt at once that the war had crossed into its final and most unforgivable territory. Because by now the enemy understood the only way to break this family was to strike where all their hearts met. Jin reached the corridor first. The king arrived 1 heartbeat after. Father and son stood over the broken hairpin and the torn silk together. Neither spoke immediately. Neither needed to. The fire between them had turned into an alliance. Now the whole house would go to war. Hanseong is learning something bigger. Not with father and son divided forever, but with something much stronger. Father and son finally speaking from the deepest truth of their shared wound. Grace restoring the center by bringing the woman into royal protection, and the enemy making its final, most desperate move. Taking the princess, the final war did not begin in the council hall. It began with a broken hairpin. That was what Grace understood the moment she saw it lying on the stone between the women's wing and the queen's chamber. 1 silver tine bent hard enough to prove Sioran had not gone quietly. Not vanished, taken. That distinction mattered. Vanishing is what happens to weak stories and careless daughters. Vanishing leaves room for confusion, tears, bad guesses, the luxury of not knowing. But Siren had left evidence. Deliberately or by force, it did not matter. The result was the same. She had turned her own abduction into a message. I fought, I was moved, and if you are clever enough, you will see how. The torn silk edge caught against the side lattice was no accident either, nor was the small arc of blood near the corridor bend where one of her captors had misjudged the kind of princess they were trying to handle. Sioran had been raised by grace. She had been sharpened by palace life. She had listened to her father and brother long enough to know that if a body is going to be taken, it must leave the room speaking, even after the mouth is gone. The palace changed shape at once. The crown prince stopped feeling like a threatened heir. He became a future king moving in present time. The king stopped feeling like a ruler balancing structures. He became a father prepared to burn through them if necessary. Grace stopped mediating. She began directing. And Hayrin, far from becoming a passive, endangered woman hidden behind seals and royal pity, became the one person alive who could read the missing network well enough to predict where they had taken the princess and why. That was what made this powerful. Not one hero. A family. The enemy's plan was elegant in its cruelty. With Sioran taken and the copied foreign letter missing, Lord Nam meant to force chaos across 3 fronts at once. First, frame the crown prince as unstable and compromised by Hayrin. If the prince moved too wildly now, if he struck before evidence was sealed, if he looked even briefly like a man driven by emotion rather than discernment, then the old court could step back into familiar language and begin saying what frightened men always say when the future stops asking permission to arrive. The heir must be steadied, guided, restrained. Second, pressure the king into a controlled succession posture under the old poison of temporary stabilizing council guidance. Not regency in name. Men like Nam were too intelligent for open theft. Something subtler. Advisory necessity, shared burden, dignified intervention while the royal household recovered its center. Third, use Sioran either as leverage or as proof that the royal family could not even defend its own daughter, thereby justifying greater house interference in the future. A daughter stolen in her own palace corridor is not merely a private loss. It is narrative. It lets the wrong men speak of protection and order with new authority. Elegant, vicious, and fatally built on one miscalculation. Lord Nam still thought this family would crack outward under pressure. They did not. They locked inward. The king wanted the city gates sealed before the second bell. Grace stopped him. Not because she disagreed with urgency, because she understood the shape of the enemy more precisely now than the ministers ever would. Lock the gates too visibly, and Nam would know immediately that Sioran mattered not only emotionally, but evidentially. He would move her or kill her faster. Panic was what he wanted. Grand gestures were what he wanted. A king raging like a father and a prince charging like a son would let the old court tell the whole story wrongly before noon. So Grace said, no public closure. The king turned toward her so sharply that the nearest guard stepped back without meaning to. She is my daughter. And she is their leverage, Grace answered, voice like cut silk. Do not hand them proof that they have reached the center. The room held. Then Hayrin spoke. Not loudly, not timidly either. There are only 3 kinds of places in the palace web where a princess can be held for negotiation without immediate public discovery, she said, eyes fixed not on the king, but on the broken hairpin in Grace's palm. A judicial holding cell is too obvious. A private noble residence is too vulnerable. That leaves old ceremonial property or transport transition quarters. Jin looked at her at once. Which? Hayrin crossed to the side table where the lower corridor maps and confiscated transport notes had already been spread beneath weighted stones. Her hand moved once over the old route marks and stopped not at the main roads, but the smaller ink notations most men would have dismissed as service trivia. Not the prisons, she said, not the ministry houses, somewhere they can delay formal transfer, conceal movement, and still call it temporary if anyone asks. Grace came to stand beside her. The two women bent over the papers, while the men in the room, king, prince, guards, secretaries, watched with that old dangerous lesson history keeps trying to teach men and still does not teach them thoroughly enough. Kingdoms are often lost or saved in the margins they told women were unimportant. Grace read the omitted transport notations, the secondary shrine inventories, the old women's household route records no current minister would know because the records belonged to ceremonial hostess assignments, dowry receiving halls, and forgotten royal guest protocols. Hayren found the pattern first, not in the grand state maps. In absence, 3 old guest complexes should have shown current seasonal use under warehouse supervision. Only 2 did. The third, a decommissioned royal guest complex near the old river warehouses, half ceremonial and half forgotten, had been marked inactive for years, and yet still appeared indirectly in lamp oil distribution and cloth rotation inventories last month. Grace looked at her. The River Court Pavilion. Hiram nodded. Half ceremonial, half logistics, close enough to the warehouses to move quietly if needed, old enough that no one younger in the court would think to search it first. Sioran had been taken not to a prison, but to a holding place disguised by irrelevance. Perfect for discreet leverage. The king was already issuing orders before the sentence fully finished. No drums, no open troop movement, no court summons, a strike force small enough to move before rumor and precise enough to kill without letting panic outrun it. And this is crucial. The king did not sideline his son to protect him. He let Jin ride at his side. That was the emotional payoff of the whole arc. There was no ceremony to it, no speech, no paternal blessing disguised as command. The king simply looked at his son across the war table and said, "You ride with me." Not because the crown prince had earned a reward, because he had become a man, because the old danger in the family had never really been that Jin would feel too much. It was whether the king would trust that feeling enough to let the man carry it into action without trying to reduce him back into a child the moment the stakes turned mortal. Jin bowed once, not as instrument, as heir. The strike force moved in darkness before the lower city had finished waking. No banners, no royal insignia, only disciplined motion through warehouse lanes and wet river stone. The old pavilion lay near the decommissioned guest quarter above the eastern loading road, where reeds had begun reclaiming the lower wall, and the outer courtyard still wore traces of old ceremonial paint beneath weather and neglect. Half abandoned, half remembered. Exactly the kind of place a surviving faction would trust because it believed itself smarter than memory. Hayren rode behind the second line and read the old plans by covered lantern while Grace remained at the palace center directing closures, false routes, and messenger interception. That too mattered. The family did not scatter. It divided by intelligence. The king led from the front, Jin at his side, Hayren's memory behind them, Grace's command holding the capital, the whole house moving at once. The rescue itself was fast. It had to be. This was not a story that needed a dozen corridors of ornamental violence. It needed intelligence under pressure. The outer guard line at the pavilion was cut before alarm. 2 watchmen dropped without cry. A side gate thought disused open because Hayren had remembered from the old guest plans that ceremonial complexes keep receiving passages where kitchens once serviced high-born women without exposing them to public approach. The guards entered through steam corridor stone and blind service turns, bypassing the front hall entirely. Inside, The air smelled of damp cedar, lamp smoke, and nervous men pretending control. The first captor died with the knife still half drawn. The second reached the bell rope and lost the hand that meant to ring it. Jin moved like his father only in moments of real danger. Without waste, without visible performance, without the emotional mess lesser men mistake for force. But he also moved like his mother in one crucial way. Once he had identified the true center, he stopped wasting time on lesser threats. Upper rooms, he said, because Shorin would not be kept below. Not if they meant to bargain with her. The hidden passage was where the enemy miscalculated last. One old guest chamber connected to the upper ceremonial wing through a narrow behind-wall route, once used to move women discreetly between receiving halls during winter audiences. Hei-rin saw the structural seam in the wall hanging before any man did. Jin pulled the panel. The king went first. Siorin was there, not broken, not weeping, furious. One captor lay bleeding already against the side table with a hairpin buried shallow near his throat. Not enough to kill, enough to remember. Another had blood across his mouth where she had clearly struck him with something heavy before he recovered. Her outer sleeve torn, her face pale, but her eyes were clear and viciously alive. When she saw the king and Jin in the doorway, she said, before either man could speak, "The short one limps on the left, and the one with the scar said Lord Nam wants father forced into council by midday." Then, after a beat, because she was still Siorin, "You were late." Jin almost laughed from sheer relief. The king almost broke. Neither did either thing in a way visible enough to satisfy the room. He cut her free himself. That mattered. No servant, no guard, the father. As soon as her wrists were freed, Siorin reached into her torn sleeve and produced the folded, copied foreign letter she had hidden against the inner lining before they took her fully. "I did not let them have it," she said. Of course she didn't. That was exactly right for her. By the time they rode back to the palace, the shape of the end had changed completely. Now the evidence was total. Hei-rin's ledger, Siorin's recovered letter, the foreign marriage correspondence, the regency design, the transfer warrants, the falsified accusations, the abduction. Lord Nam had nowhere left to turn dignity into cover. So the final confrontation came after the rescue, not before. That was important. No reactive courtroom, no crisis hearing before the daughter was safe. This was not the old palace. Not anymore. The court was assembled after the royal family had already rejoined itself. That gave the scene its force. Grace entered with Siorin at her side. Not hidden, not theatrically displayed. Alive. The crown prince entered bearing the exhaustion of the rescue openly enough that the room could see he had ridden, fought, and not slept. Blood darkened one edge of his sleeve. He had not changed it. Good. Hei-rin stood behind Grace's shoulder, not as accused woman now, not as romantic distraction, but as a witness whose survival had outlasted the court's design. The king stood at the center. Lord Nam looked old for the first time, not physically, morally, as if the room had finally turned bright enough that all the careful years of self-possession could no longer arrange him into innocence. He tried once. Of course he did. Men like him always try once. He said the kingdom required stability. He said he had acted only to preserve succession from emotional disorder. He said future kings must be prevented from becoming captives to passion. He said the girl's evidence remained compromised by irregular custody and illicit proximity to the prince. He said the princess's removal was regrettable, but perhaps inevitable, in a palace where feeling had too long been allowed to govern the center. The king looked at him for a long moment. Then he said the line that should define the entire next generation saga. "No, men like you only ever call love disorder because you know a house built on it cannot be owned." Silence. Absolute. Not because the sentence was pretty, because it was final. It named not just Lord Nam's politics, but the whole old disease of the court, the fear of anything it could not manipulate by starving it first, the fear of marriages not built for convenience, sons not raised into loneliness, daughters not ornamental enough to ignore, women not willing to disappear, men not willing to call that disorderly just because it embarrassed old systems. Then the king turned, not to the ministers, but to his son. The crown prince stood there blood-marked from the rescue, exhausted, furious, fully himself. Hayrin behind Grace's shoulder. Sioran pale but upright beside the queen, wrists still faintly raw beneath her sleeves. The king spoke so the whole court could hear. They fought to keep you from becoming a child who loved too deeply, then a prince who chose too freely, then a man who could not be controlled. He paused, then, they were right to fear what we raised. That line struck the hall with the force of revelation, because it was not accusation, not warning, recognition. The crown prince held his father's gaze and did not bow immediately, not out of disrespect, out of weight, because the moment demanded something truer than ceremony first. It demanded that a son hear, in full public witness, that his father had finally seen the man he had become and had chosen not to crush that man back into easier shapes for the comfort of cowards. Then Jin bowed, not as broken son, not as obedient instrument, as heir receiving not only authority, but recognition. The king's final act broke the old cycle completely. He did not force Jin to abandon Hayrin for stability. That would have ruined the whole point, would have made the entire saga a lie. Instead, he did something smarter and stronger. He cleared Hayrin's father's name publicly. Royal investigator Yoon Se-jin was restored in the record as loyal servant of the throne, murdered for uncovering survival channels of the old faction. His confiscated properties were returned posthumously, his death register amended, his name spoken in court with honor instead of burial. Then the king restored Hayrin's lawful standing, not as pardon, as correction. She had never been what the court accused. The law itself had been bent around her to make convenience resemble justice. He placed her under the queen's direct protection as witness and honored daughter of a loyal investigator, which did two things at once: made her untouchable by the old methods, and wrote her presence into royal structure strongly enough that no one could remove her quietly again without naming themselves to the whole kingdom. Lord Nam's network was crushed through record, confiscation, and public disgrace. Not just the man himself, but the elegant machinery around him. Trade debts, hidden routes, courier houses, advisory blocks, marriage channels, foreign leverage, even the old men who had smiled on the margins while telling themselves they had not truly chosen a side. And then the king made the declaration that mattered most, not about law alone, about formation. The future king of Joseon, he said, will not be formed through the emotional mutilation of his heart. That sentence stood in the hall like an inheritance rewritten. He did not marry Jin and Hayrin immediately. That would have been too easy, too neat, too unlike the story itself. Better than easy, he legitimized possibility. He made it lawful for her to remain. That was stronger. It did not end the future. It opened it. And because future is more addictive than a rushed completion, the room understood at once that what had just been saved was not only a woman's life or a prince's heart. It was the right to let the next generation exist honestly. The final private scene belonged to Grace and the king, not because the children did not matter, because this was still their story at the center. After the court had broken, after Sioran had been returned to safety, after Jin and Hayrin had been left in the first real silence they had earned, a silence beneath the outer lanterns where nothing had to be spoken quickly because both had finally survived long enough to be allowed time. Grace found the king in the plum courtyard where so much of their life once turned. He stood beneath the darkening branches with his hands clasped behind him, older now, sharper, more tired, more loved. Grace came to stand beside him. For a moment they said nothing. They had long since outgrown the need to fill every shared silence with proof. At last Grace said softly, "We spent years keeping him alive." The king's gaze remained on the darkening branches. Yes. And all this time, the harder task was waiting. Now he looked at her. Yes. Grace let out one slow breath. He became exactly what they feared. This time the king's mouth shifted, not into amusement, into something deeper. Good. That was the final emotional truth. Not because they wanted a cruel son, because they wanted a free one. A breeze moved through the branches, and the last plum petals of the season loosened into dusk. Beyond the courtyard, under the outer lantern glow, the family was visible at a distance. Jin standing with Haerin, both changed by the night and the war, and the fact of having survived to speak again. Seorin alive and watchful beside the steps, one wrist bandaged, expression already sharpening back into dangerous intelligence. The future no longer abstract, no longer only a child in lessons or an heir in ceremony, but a living shape carrying love, danger, and the reopened war of a kingdom that still did not know what to do with people it could not own. Grace followed the line of the king's gaze, then, very quietly, "It is strange." "What is?" "That I once entered this city as the woman they feared would unmake the throne." She looked toward their children, "and now everything they fear most is what our house made possible." The king turned to her fully then. There was pride in his face, and exhaustion, and that old deep tenderness that had survived poison, babies, wars, children, and all the court's attempts to name it disorder. "The Black Rose of Hanseong," he said, "was never going to end with one generation." Grace's eyes burned. No tears, just heat. Below them, the crown prince said something low to Haerin. She answered. Seorin glanced toward them once, saw her parents beneath the plum branches, and looked away again with the faint private understanding of a daughter who had grown up under love strong enough to teach her what a house is supposed to be. Not with the children replacing the parents, not with the old story fading, not with the court finally becoming good or peace finally becoming simple, but with something stronger, the king and Grace seeing, at last, that the son they once fought to protect had become a man the kingdom truly could fear, a daughter proving just as impossible to erase, and a royal house surviving the next generation's first great war without sacrificing the very thing that made it worth inheriting. The Black Rose of Hanseong began with a woman entering history as rumor. Now it had become something larger, a dynasty so shaped by love, truth, and chosen loyalty that every old order still alive in Joseon could only do one thing in its presence: fear the future.